Also, in order to understand reproductive oppression, you have to understand that it is based on the human rights framework. And what we witnessed overseas was the entire women's movement of the world were using the human rights framework to claim the rights that we were trying to squeeze into a very flawed constitutional system. And the U.S. Constitution is so inadequate when it comes to protecting women's rights. As a matter of fact, we never even passed the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, to include women in the Constitution. So, I mean, it is a shaky document that we've had to amend over and over again and still ain't got it right. It was written by white slaveholders. What can you say? Okay. Political human rights are freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to vote, though, of course, y'all in Florida know that you do not have the right to have your votes counted. Okay. And they are busily stealing elections with those diabolical machines as quick as they can. Economic human rights, those are our rights to have an economy managed in such a way that it meets our needs. The right to a living wage, for example, is an economic human right. They just raised the minimum wage, and it's still about $5 below a living wage. And so we still have to fight for that. But the right for vacation, workers' rights are human rights. Social human rights, the right to have our human needs met. Now think about it. If you're a human being, if you don't have food, clothing, shelter, health care, education, welfare, or social supports if you need them, you're not going to be considered human very long. And so people try to say that human rights are aspirations and not obligations. But these same people that say that, ask them for how long they could hold their self together if they didn't get food or health care or their children couldn't access education. Cultural human rights, of course, is freedom of religion, right to speak your own language. And for those of you who have not quite figured this out, that if you provide services in a language other than English, you are in fact a human rights defender. You are affirming and defending people's human rights, which is a wonderful thing to realize about your organization if you didn't know it before. But the other part of cultural human rights that is pertinent to the discussion of reproductive justice is that freedom of religion is a human right, but freedom from religion is also a human right. And freedom not to have someone else's religion imposed upon you is also a human right. Environmental rights were added after the 1940s. As a matter of fact, they didn't get added until the 1970s, when people started recognizing that without clean air, clean water, the right to not have toxins in our neighborhoods, that the rest of your human rights will not be enjoyed for very long. I mean, what's the purpose of having the right to free speech if all you can say is that I'm dying from lack of clean water? Yeah, so those are very important. Developmental human rights are a little harder to understand, but they are the right demanded by people in the developing world to control their own natural resources. For example, some of us would argue that our war against Iraq is in violation of their developmental human rights. Why? Because it's really a war about oil. Let us be clear, no one's fooled. Does anybody really believe that we are there to free the Iraqi people? And the sexual rights. Those are the rights that have been demanded by the women's movement. And it's pretty clear the right to have or not have children, the right to marry, and if we'll marry and when and under what conditions, which was very important, by the way, for women for the developing world to articulate because of forced marriages of young girls. They were very, very clear that they had to protest that, and it's still going on. Same-sex rights, transgender rights, the right to birth control and abortion, the right to sexual pleasure, which is one of my favorites, and the right to define families. These are all sexual rights, and so put them all together, that's the human rights framework. The concept you need to understand to really grasp reproductive justice is the concept of intersectionality. which of course is a very academic word, just basically saying that we all have multiple identities at the same time, that we are both women, and we could be mothers, and we could be students, and we could be workers, and we could be African American or Colombian or Cuban or all of these things. We could be Christian, we could be Protestant, we could be, abled or disabled. I mean, no human being has one identity. And so we need an analysis that speaks to all of our identities. And when you talk about speaking to all of those identities, it's called intersectionality. So to counter reproductive oppression, we at SisterSong have coined our own phrase, our own vision for reproductive justice. We believe that reproductive justice will be achieved when women amass the power, and that's power that is economic, social, and political, to make healthy decisions about our own bodies, our own labor, our own sexuality, and our reproduction for ourselves. It's also a strategy that requires working across social justice issues to bring people together, to do work in an intersectional way, keeping all of the issues on the table. And then finally, it's a process and a practice, because it means that if you're going to bring all these different people together across these diversities, like SisterSong has done, not trying to get everybody to agree, but getting everybody to agree to work together, which is different than simply getting everybody to agree, then you might want to have a process to keep people at the table. Because heretofore in our social justice organizing, we have a tendency to put all our emphasis on getting people to agree with us rather than getting people to agree to work with us, while continuing to believe whatever they believe. Does that make sense to people? This is reproductive justice, and this is what we're trying to do to it. To summarize, we define the primary problem as reproductive oppression. We use an intersectional analysis. It's based on a worldview called human rights, and most importantly, it takes an individual and links them to the communities in which they are embedded.